Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm John Dodge.
I'm Matt Coppinger.
Matt's kind of like a big deal around here, you know. I love sharing this stage with him. So welcome to Troubleshooting VMware View, looking under the hood. In this session, we're going to talk quite a lot about how to troubleshoot View. We're going to get into the weeds a little bit. One thing to know about some of the slides you'll see is you're going to see a lot of text on there. One thing I'd like you to take away from this session is the deck. So not literally in this session, because we'll make sure that we'll send out the content to you via Socialcast. But know that the text is not on the slide for the purpose of reading it. So there's not going to be a test on all the log entries that you're going to see. There is a lot of text to it, though, so that you could refer to it later. So by quick show of hands, who here in the room has already deployed VMware View in your environment? I want to take a picture of that. That is awesome. Another show of hands, because I do this arm calisthenics thing every now and again. So raise your hand if you have 500 or more seats. Okay. Well, it's a good number. 1,000 seats or more? Fewer? 5,000 or more? Okay. So that's about what we see as well. So the information that we have here will help you on your way up, especially when we start to get to very large scale. So why don't you start us off here, Matt?
Thanks, John. So my name's Matt Coppinger. I'm an architect with End User Computing BU. Clearly not from around here, but I have been involved in a lot of our larger View deployments out in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So, and both John and I have spent a lot of time traveling the world, troubleshooting various large View deployments. So a lot of the content you'll see here is it's kind of the basics around troubleshooting. We'll dive into the logs and things like that, and we'll try and cover as much ground as possible, but we will focus on kind of the common issues that we see out there, okay?
So one thing about Matt and I, we have so far in the last nearly 5 years, managed to be engaged with every single one of our enterprise, large-scale enterprise customers. After a while, after being lucky and resolving a couple of nasty issues and deployments that have gone wrong, now they seem to call us whenever anything is going wrong, saying, things are really bad, send John or Matt. So that's kind of good in a way, because we get quite experienced at how the product works and where to discover the information that you need for troubleshooting.
Thanks, John. So you've all seen the disclaimer slide. To be honest, there's not really much roadmap information in this deck, so we're not really going to be talking about futures. And there are no real face-melting demos either, so apologies for that. Or any kind of, there's not that many pretty pictures either, so...
Anyone appreciate not having their face melted? I don't know, I guess it could be good.
So the agenda for today, we've got an hour, and we'll have some time for questions at the end. What we're going to look at is what can go wrong with View, and we'll specifically look at 4 domains, what we call the problem domains around View. And we'll look at the common issues that we see in each of those domains, how you can identify them, and to some extent how you can fix them. And then we've got a few resources at the end.
So now you've deployed View. What could go wrong? Well, there's, for those of you out there with your deployments, how many folks have run into a problem with View? Okay, so a few of you. Not many.
Oops.
Wow. You know, the last group didn't have as many problems. I don't know. It's might be you. No, I'm just kidding.
We kind of like to think that View just works, but clearly...
But, you know, View does tend to work, and it works great. When it stops working, then you have this uncomfortable moment where you think to yourself, like, wow, I don't really know where to look to find the problem. And so we'll take a look under the hood at a few of the common problems that you might run into. First, you might have trouble connecting to View. Maybe you get disconnected randomly. You might discover that your display performance is not that good. You might get the desktop not available. Anybody run into desktop not available? And another quick show of hands. Who's the administrator for that network? So isn't that a little uncomfortable when you try to log on, you get that desktop not available, go contact the administrator, and you are the administrator? You're like, I would call myself, but I think I'm busy. I'm seeing an error in View. What does it mean? Sometimes our developers think that they're putting in a face-melting, clear error message, like desktop not available. kind of like telling me the obvious, isn't it? Because if it was available, I wouldn't have this message. So tell me why. So we're going to tell you how to figure out why. vCenter sometimes throws errors, and you might not know where to look next. And has anyone gotten this complaint from their customers? My desktop is slow. Slow in what sense? As in not fast, as in slower than usual. What does this mean exactly? So, we do have ways to go try to figure out, well, maybe you had this baseline and now you're below that, so let's go take a look under the covers.
All right. The animation there is about as funky as this presentation gets.
Give him a big round of applause. He worked hard on that.
That's a great demonstration of my PowerPoint skills.
Nicely done. So, one of the things that I do for VMware is I build technical enablement. And oftentimes, this sort of has me following a process about a process. And I've been fortunate that I had some really good mentors very early in my career who taught me how to troubleshoot. I used to work for basically a value-added network. So I learned my troubleshooting chops in telco. And there was something really formative about that. So what I've discovered sometimes is that maybe you're troubleshooting an environment that you don't own everything yourself, or maybe you're working on a rather complex environment like View is, and you want to know what's wrong. And I would tell you the way to figure out what's wrong is by identifying what's right and narrowing down into a specific domain where the problem lies. And so when we know that the problem is in a given domain inside an enterprise architecture, I like to refer to that as the problem domain. So there's really several problem domains that we have here that I want to identify up on the board here. First, we've got the View client domain, the network, because there's a lot of networking that's going on back and forth. View Manager, also known as the View Brokers. View Composer, which is essentially a service that runs on top of a database and helps us spin out linked clones. vCenter Server, which we get powering provisioning operations from. Compute, which you can think of as ESX, but really specifically CPU and memory. And finally, storage. Now, has anybody noticed any new storage vendors lately? There's been a lot. And who didn't know what an IOP was just 2 years ago? Quick show of hands. I got a real education. Everybody knew 3 years ago, 4 years ago. So I got a real education in IOPS at the very beginning. And so in the very early days of View, we were deploying for what? Footprint. That turned out to be not so smart. So later on, we realized how important the IOPS was. And so we'll talk about how to troubleshoot storage. We don't have the time to go deep in storage because we could spend the next week together on that topic. Anything to add there, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, this is just, hopefully everyone's aware of the architecture of View. So we've just broken it down into its main components there. And that's kind of really where we start, is trying to understand which component is broken or which component we need to go to look at. So one of the things we wanted to bring to you actually is we went and talked to our global support organization, GSS. These are the guys that you call when you've got a problem. And we said, what's the top 6 issues that you're seeing? And so I don't know why I said top 6. I think I said top 5, and they said, hey, there's 6 or something like that.
They gave us a 5+1.
Yeah, 5+1.
That's very helpful. Typical GSS.
So number one problem they're seeing at the moment is with SSL certs. So in 5.1, we changed some of the stuff we do around securing the components. Out of the box, of course, it just works, but clearly for production, you need to be installing SSL certs for each of the different components. So, a lot of our customers have had problems with this. We have just released a white paper on VMware.com to kind of, a little bit of a foundation around, what SSL certs are, how you can create them, how you can put them into View. So please take some time. If you are upgrading to View 5.1, please make sure, you get the white paper on the SSL stuff, read the product documentation, okay?
So quick show of hands, and I'll keep doing this throughout the event so, you don't get bored. But quick show of hands, who's a PKI expert? I'm no PKI expert. There's always one in every crowd. Welcome, thank you. You could be a really popular guy. So,
You're presenting the next slide.
That's right. Passing knowledge of PKI? A few more hands. Really intimidated and scared by PKI? That was me. And so the good news is that at first PKI seems really intimidating. it's actually not that bad. And so after a little bit of exposure and you start to know the first few steps, which will be in the white paper that we'll be publishing, you'll eventually have no trouble handling all the PKI required for View 5.1. And the good news is the bonus, you'll make View much more secure by getting really good with PKI. Of course, you can use Microsoft's Enterprise CA, or you can go with third party. So we make it really easy and flexible.
Thanks, John. So persona is the second common issue that we're seeing, really mainly around permissions, but there is also some interesting situations when you use persona with redirected folders and Microsoft profiles. So there's a KB article. If you're going to implement View persona along with Microsoft profiles, we highly recommend you read this article and make sure that you know what does and does not work there. The third one is really, well, this is all outside of storage issues, right? So this is top 6, but probably the number 1 is people having performance issues with storage. But a lot of these storage issues come from, not optimizing the VM image. Okay, we see a lot of people doing, for some reason, P2Ving their physical image, because the guys that manage the physical image are like, we don't want to have to manage another image, thank you very much. So they force you to kind of use the physical image, and it's got lots of rubbish on there and doesn't quite work correctly in a VM.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What is rubbish?
Trash.
Trash. Oh, excellent. Sorry.
Rubbish. A great example. I was working with a bank in the UK, and they just used a physical image, and they had this app that restricted physical USB access, and they had that running on a VM. Right? It's like, well, that's pointless. But it was actually creating 75% of the write I/O in their environment, and they brought down enterprise-class SAN by just deploying this image and rolled out 3,000 desktops. So they learned very quickly that they needed to optimize the image and get rid of stuff that really wasn't applicable for the VM.
So a little word of advice. Friends don't let friends P2V into View.
Connectivity is the other one. So, View has some, network requirements around PC over IP and some of the network requirements between the different components, between the connection servers, security servers. So we'll kind of cover that a little bit, but please be aware of that. The fifth one is PC over IP sizing. So we've had a lot of people kind of saying, well, how do I size PC over IP? We're very lucky. We've got a very smart guy who works in our office of the CTO, Andre Lebovici, and he has a wonderful blog, myvirtualcloud.net. Who's heard of that? Wow. Cool. Yeah, it's a great blog. He's in our CTO office who gets to play around with everything and a lot of spare time to play around in his lab and
I don't think he works very hard.
Really
Lots
good
of time
IP.
for blogging.
He has a PC over IP calculator on there, so it's web-based form, and you can go around and play with that and help you size, particularly if you're kind of extending the deployment out to maybe a remote office or branch office or something like that. And then finally, how to troubleshoot PC over IP. We'll do a little bit of that today, but really the PC over IP Jedi is Chuck Hurstius. So if you get, I don't know if he's doing his session later on today or maybe he's already done it. If you missed it, then get hold of that session content. He also has a website, mindfluxinc.net, and he has a log viewer tool that you can use which visualizes the PC over IP log output. So it puts it into some really nice charts and graphs and things and shows you potentially where the PC over IP is having issues. So definitely recommend you download. It's a Java app actually, so you can download it and he will automatically update it as the logs change, etc. So
best of all, I think it's priced exactly right. It's free.
Yeah.
Anybody check out the keynote yesterday? Did you see Appshift? Anybody excited about Appshift? Can we give Appshift a big round of applause? Really cool. So the idea for Appshift was created by Daniel Beveridge, who's in the office of the CTO. Appshift itself was written by Chuck Hurstius, pretty much by himself. That man is intelligent. You go check out his blog, you'll find a lot of really interesting stuff there. And he's been releasing his own tools there when he has the time.
And just reminding me, actually, the session content for this session was published on the Social Cast about half an hour ago. So these slides are available now on the Social Cast site.
Is everybody on the VMworld community on Social Cast? Another really cool EUC product, right? We're really excited about that.
So let's take a very quick look at the network diagram, because I was reviewing some of our product documentation recently, and I realized there's some stuff missing. So I kind of pinged the guys and said, you know, for next release of the documentation, we need to update this. But in View 5, we introduced the ability to split out View Composer. And View Composer is actually not on this network diagram. And a couple of customers have come up with issues where they've installed View Composer in a standalone VM, it's on the VM network, but it doesn't necessarily have, or didn't have the rights or network access to the ESX hosts. And that causes a problem, okay? Previously, View Composer was installed on vCenter server. Clearly that has, you know, network access to the ESXi hosts or ESX hosts. But when you split out View Composer, you might not have that access set up. And it's important to know that View Composer actually needs to talk directly to the ESX hosts over TCP port 902. So if you are doing deployments or you are moving into using View Composer, keep that one in mind and make sure that you're providing access both to vCenter and for View Composer from and to the ESX hosts. So let's talk a little bit about some of the basics around troubleshooting. Hopefully everyone that's deployed View is familiar with the administrator console. Okay? This is basically where we'll see any potential issues or any issues in the environment. So you can see here some red and green boxes. This is the first place that you can go and check the status of the View environment. Okay, so very important you access this and take a look at the different components. Here we can see everything's green except for one of the connection servers or the connection server. The connection server will actually show red if you have not installed some SSL certs. So if you're using the default out-the-box ones from VMware, the connection server will show red. Doesn't necessarily mean the environment's broken and not working, but just keep that in mind, okay? If you do see red, it could be something like you just haven't installed the SSL certs.
We consider security very, very important, so much so that even if you have accepted via the thumbprint of the VMware self-signed cert that we include with our product and what has been there for many years, then we're going to consider this a problem for you. So we're going to flag it, and we're going to say make sure you do the right thing here and put a proper certificate on the connections.
Okay, so we're not going to spend too much on the time on the administrator console. It's pretty kind of obvious what it shows, but it's just important to point that out so you know kind of initially where to go. The other thing that we feel around troubleshooting is really understand how View works. We see a lot of problems between, when a user tries to connect to View and they try to get provisioned a VM, that's where most of the problems occur. So we're going to actually walk through and go through the logs and actually see a successful kind of View connection from a user and a provisioning of a virtual desktop. So we're going to walk you through that so you can understand what should be happening in the environment. We'll be looking at the logs, as I mentioned. So hopefully, if you've deployed View, you'll know that on the connection server itself, if you go into Start menu, Programs, VMware View, you can actually set the logging level on the connection server. Okay? We recommend that in troubleshooting situations, you set that to debug. There is a higher level called trace, but just be very wary of setting that. Your logs will fill up very, very quickly. But by default, it's set to kind of info, so definitely set it to debug if you need to do some troubleshooting or want to do some troubleshooting, or just set it to debug. It will really help you out. Yeah, for kicks. We use tools like Beartail. So who's familiar with Beartail here?
Not a very popular tool. What about my Linux and Unix admins, the tail command? Everybody knows tail. A lot more people are familiar with tail. We think that Beartail is a pretty cool tool. The reason is, first of all, it's a Windows GUI version of tail, and it gives you a tabbed interface, so you can open up multiple log files at one time. So we'll be talking about those log files in just a moment, but the cool thing is that sometimes we've got things that are going on between connection servers. So a client will log on, talk to one connection server, another connection server is talking to vCenter, and you want to know if those messages are syncing up. So Beartail will let you open up several log files simultaneously, and you could provide a search string. That search string will show up in a highlighted color, and you can put multiple colors in. Beartail also has a pretty great pricing model. The standard version is free, and I think you guys are starting to know I really love free tools. The professional version is a little bit more of an investment, but I don't think it's too bad. It's only $30. So I strongly recommend, if you're going to find yourself troubleshooting View, that you go out and you spend the $30 and you get yourself the professional version of Beartail. It's pretty good.
I mean, clearly any kind of, log viewer will help here.
No,
but,
it has to be Beartail.
Not sure we're allowed to say that, John. So you will be looking at the logs, but really we're using the logs to kind of match and filter around unique session IDs to find out what's actually happening to our user and the VMs that are assigned to them. So we'll be looking at connection broker logs, view agent logs, and sometimes the PC over IP logs that sit on the virtual desktops themselves. And then finally, we've expanded the kb.vmware.com site massively over the last 2 years with lots of great content on View and ThinApp and things like View Composer. So if you are having issues in your environment, clearly, Google is your friend, right? We all know that. But
I have a local copy on my iPhone.
Sorry?
I keep a local copy of Google on my iPhone.
Yeah. kb.vmware.com for our knowledge base articles.
I really don't.
So let's quickly jump in. Domain 1, failure to communicate. Yep. Very unhappy user there.
Anybody know this woman?
Yeah.
We've helped this woman before, haven't we? Our users come to us in these states sometimes.
So really, domain 1 is about connectivity, to the View environment from View client, or connectivity to the virtual desktop. So we'll kind of talk a little bit about PC over IP and connecting to View and those kind of things. So this is where it gets a bit kind of like, what's happening? There's a wall of text. So don't be too intimidated. We'll take you through it slowly. First of all, if you want to understand whether or not a client is actually connected to the connection server, we can check in the connection server logs. The location is there for Windows 2008. We can also use the event database. How many of you here are familiar with the event database? Okay, so what View will do is once you've configured the event database in View, you can use the same database as View Composer, database server. It will log all the important events happening in View to that database. And we'll show you the database entries for each of these kind of main events here as we go through. So let's just quickly look at this wall of text and work out what's going on. The first line, client connects. So when a View client attempts to connect to the connection server, so this is no authentication's been done, I'm just typing in the URL of the connection server, hit connect. The connection server will log a request from that client. So here you can see the client, the View client machine is 192.168.2.1. Okay, that's the client IP address that's connecting. And all you're seeing here is that the connection server is saying, okay, I got the request. I'm going to send back, we use XML to send back configuration information to the View client. So in that XML is stuff like, the domains that you could potentially authenticate against, for example. So I send that information back to the View client, which populates the login box, and then the user will attempt to authenticate to the connection server. So the next thing here, broker authentication. You can see that user, Matt C, that's me, has a unique session ID. And now we just kind of write up the first 4 digits and the last 4 alphanumerics there. So that's the unique session ID. And that will identify my session, okay, throughout the logs. And it's showing you here that I'm trying to authenticate to the domain future office. All right? If I successfully authenticate against the broker, so connection server is hitting AD and checking to see if I've entered the correct password for my particular user, it will show this Matt C has successfully authenticated to VDM. What is VDM? VDM is the name of our old, VDM2, View 3. So don't be frightened, it is View, but it used to be called VDM. And again, we can see here my session ID is also there linked to my username. And then finally, we have an audit entry in there that kind of has a complete dump of user ID, okay, user SID. Okay, and that's important because that will help us track some further information down the road. And you can see here that there's the user SID, and finally in the event database, once the user has authenticated to the connection server, right? This is we've not even hit any virtual desktops yet. I get this broker user logged in. All right. So just skipping over now into kind of some of those connectivity issues around user experience. How many of you here have experienced the black screen of death from PC over IP? Yep. Okay. So there's a couple of reasons that can happen. The first one, obvious one, is that somewhere there's a firewall that's not opened up and there's ports being blocked. So we actually changed the port for PC over IP. I know you can thank us. We changed it to port 4172, and you need to open up both TCP and UDP ports. That's probably a pretty obvious one, right? So, once you do that and you're still getting the issue, it could be a number of other things. What we also see is that sometimes when the View agent or VM tools is updated in the virtual desktop, it can overwrite the display driver that we use for PC over IP. And therefore, the actual PC over IP bits are not on the desktop, and therefore the service can't launch.
And that's a little less obvious.
Yeah, that's a little bit less obvious. But what you can do is, we'll go through how you identify which desktop the user's been connected to, but you can get onto the desktop, open up the PC over IP logs on the virtual desktop, and look for a couple of different things. The error attaching to SVGA DevTap, that means that the display driver is not there. Okay, that's what that error indicates. The second one, the connection timed out, is typically associated with, the firewall port's been blocked, and my client has not been able to connect to the View agent, and therefore the actual PC over IP session will just time out. There is a third issue, and this one is related to upgrading to View 5.1. So how many of you have upgraded to View 5.1?
Nice.
Okay. How many of you are going to upgrade to View 5.1? All right. Okay, so little tip here. When you upgrade to View 5.1, for some reason, some of the settings are not updated. So it doesn't take your old settings and place them in the new settings. I know. You can thank us for that one as well. Specifically around the PC over IP secure gateway settings. So within the server settings in the View Administrator, you have the ability to turn on the secure gateway for PC over IP and enter in an external URL for connectivity into the PC over IP environment. Those, for some reason, when we upgrade to View 5.1, get wiped. And because they get wiped, if you're using the gateway, your user's going to get the wall of, the black screen of death. Okay? So just keep that one in mind. Poor quality of display, typically associated with some kind of issue on the network, where you start to see some artifacts from PC over IP, often linked to either, poor bandwidth, bad latency, or the fact that you're not doing QoS. There's some great collateral out there on how to tune PC over IP. Won't dive into it too much, but on the PC over IP server logs, they actually sit on the View agent on the virtual desktop. You can actually look for a couple of things. If a user reports bad experience, get onto their VM or get hold of the logs that are on the VM, and you can look for a couple of things. The first one here, where it says loss, that's indicating packet loss. Okay, so that immediately shows you that somewhere along the line, packets are being dropped. Okay, this often happens because out of the box, some of the network devices use a congestion management configuration that's not ideal for PC over IP. Okay, so we've got some stuff on how to tune the network for PC over IP out there. We won't cover it too much here.
Fortunately, we've run into some issues in the field where we ran into these improperly configured networks, and then we got to learn what happens to PC over IP when the packets don't arrive or the packets arrive out of order. Something interesting about PC over IP, it's by default set up to auto-tune. So it will adjust to network conditions. Primarily, the intention was to auto-tune for bandwidth, because if there's ample bandwidth, we want to take a really wide channel and send a lot of data across the network. We do that so that we could have a really high-fidelity video or image experience at the end client. But because congestion is something that can be volatile, what we're able to do is kind of dial back a little bit, maybe lower the quality just a little, until the bandwidth is more available and the issues are resolved. But if the packets don't arrive, then PC over IP can't auto-tune, and so this is a really bad condition. There isn't much you could do with PC over IP if the packets aren't arriving, so it's essential to determine what's going on that leads to the packets not arriving or arriving out of order as they can in some congestion management.
And you can actually see this happening in this second log entry under the poor quality display. What's happened is because of packet loss, PC over IP has decided, right, I'm going to start reducing the amount of bandwidth that the user is using for their session. So it's dropping down from 234 down to 176. And that's obviously going to have an impact on user experience. So you can very quickly see in the logs on the virtual desktop, whether there's been packet loss associated with the user's issue. So randomly disconnected session. Anyone seen this? Okay, so one of the common issues that we have around randomly disconnected session is actually not that random. It typically happens around about 15 minutes after the user logs in. 15 minutes because what's happening is when a user logs into the virtual desktop, we actually have a process start called WSSM, okay, which is essentially the session manager process. And what that's doing is it's going to do all of the communication between the view agent and the connection server to keep the connection server up to date about what's happening inside the VM. What we're doing there is essentially we daisy chaining the GINA. So what we recommend typically is the last thing to install on the virtual desktop is our view agent to make sure that the session manager process exe is put into the registry and it's running when the user logs in. Sometimes people essentially have other applications that want to also daisy chain onto the GINA, and sometimes they actually wipe out that process from running. So essentially the user logs in, the session manager doesn't start, and after 15 minutes, the connection server says, well, hang on, I haven't received any data from the view agent. So clearly nothing's happening on there, the user's not in there, so I'm just going to cut that session. So it just logs off the user, okay? And so where you can see is in the view agent logs on the virtual desktop, you'll see this pending expired in the logs, okay? So you'll see that and you'll know that then basically the view agent has not been able to contact the connection server. This could be because the process hasn't started, or it might be some kind of network connectivity issue. I visited a customer, and they had a fantastic issue where they were just, not getting anything. They were getting kind of agent unavailable on the virtual desktops. And when I looked at the situation, they were running about probably 50 VMs or something like that on their host. And I looked at the vSwitch configuration, and they had 8 ports configured on the vSwitch. So,
a little awkward.
50 doesn't really go into 8. So I think what happened is they had a general best practice to limit the number of ports on vSwitch, but they didn't take into consideration the fact they were going to be deploying all these desktops on that vSwitch. So just one to keep in mind there. That
could be a little tricky to find as well. Sometimes there's some delegation between the desktop team and the server team. So you have those vSphere, ESX guys helping you out.
And they were kind of screaming at me, we're deploying all these VMs and we're getting agent unavailable. And then when I kind of pointed out they didn't have enough ports on the vSwitch, they were slightly embarrassed about that. But there you go. Okay, second domain is desktop not available. So what we're talking about here is not really connectivity issues, but essentially there's been some problem provisioning desktops through View. Yeah, or it could be, as I mentioned, that the agent is not communicating with the broker. So one of the first things that we can do is actually try and see if any desktops were available to be returned to the actual user. So in the broker logs, what you're looking for is this desktops handler. You're looking for a log there. Again, I've used my session ID, okay, and or the user SID to identify my session information. And what this is, the desktops handler is telling me here that it's returning potentially 2 virtual desktops for me to connect to. So it's identified the pool, the gold non-persistent pool. Okay, so it's identified a pool that I'm entitled to, and there are 2 VMs in that pool that are available for me to connect to. Okay, so there you can quickly see users connected and brokers found some virtual desktops to connect me to or assign me to. So what happens then? Okay, so essentially what's happening is as a user, I've authenticated to the connection broker. It has returned the desktops that are available to me, or the pools. Okay. Then I say, actually, I want to connect to gold pool. Thank you very much. So I select my desktop, hit connect. What we then log in the event database is this broker desktop request. The user has requested a desktop. And in the broker, this farm imp process will now log against my session ID, will say, basically will go and find me a virtual desktop. That virtual desktop is identified by this CN name here in bold, okay? That identifies the desktop that's been allocated to my user, okay? Very useful. It's not using, the domain name of the desktop or anything like that. So it's just using this CN name, okay? That is the VM that's going to be allocated to me, okay? And then we log and say, we've allocated a new session. You can see in that pool, gold, non-persistent pool. Okay. Once I've done that in the event database, broker machine has been allocated. So that means that I've successfully found a desktop for the user to connect to. The connection server will then kick off the SSO process. So it will authenticate using my credentials. It will log me into the virtual desktop. I still have not connected to that virtual desktop yet. So the connection server is doing that on my behalf. It will say I'm using domain for SSO future office, right? So again, my session ID here, if you don't see that, okay, then the user's probably sat at the virtual desktop looking at a Microsoft login screen. Okay, so for SSO to actually have happened, you need to have seen this log in the connection server logs.
And you may be sitting here thinking, why do we have session ID and user information? That would be a very good question. The reason is that in some scenarios, you might want to enable one user to be able to access multiple desktops at the same time. It's very popular in IT scenarios, but there may be other scenarios as well. So we certainly allow a user to connect into View multiple times. And so as a consequence now, we have one user ID, but each desktop connection will have a separate session.
So how do I know which virtual machine the user's been allocated? Okay, I've got the CN name. Okay, but how do I actually find out at this point, what's happened? And what you can actually do is use a tool called ADSI Edit. How many of you are familiar with this tool? Okay, so it sits on the connection server, Microsoft product, sits on the connection server. We use an LDAP directory to store the configuration information of View. So it's very easy to use ADSI Edit to connect to that LDAP, okay, and look at the schema and configuration of View. So there's a KB article on how to use ADSI Edit to, connect to the View LDAP and look at the schema. Highly recommend you look at that.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Should we edit anything using ADSI Edit?
Absolutely not, okay? Absolutely not. Unless, of course, it tells you to in the KB article, John.
Well,
okay?
Only on the advice of the professionals.
But you definitely shouldn't be using ADSI Edit.
Look, I cut myself shaving once. I mean, come on.
It's like giving, a child scissors to run with sometimes. But
when should we use ADSI Edit, if not to edit?
Okay, so what we're doing here is I'm going to take that CN name for the desktop, okay, and I'm going to find it in LDAP, so then I can find further information about that desktop. So here, just to confuse you, we store the desktop information in the OU servers.
Give us a round of applause. That was brilliant.
Woo! All right. So in there you can see at the top there, top right-hand panel, you can see there's the CN name for the desktop. Found my desktop, double-click on that, and then I've got all these different properties in there that View stores about that desktop. So you can find things like, the name of the desktop, a whole bunch of different stuff. It's actually cool just to go through some of this configuration information. It gives you a better feeling, an idea for how View works. So definitely recommend kind of looking at that. Please don't edit any information in there, though.
Another good use of that information is taking advantage of our PowerShell interface to do some custom automation work, which is very popular, automation, troubleshooting, et cetera. And so what you could do is get a good idea of where the information is by stepping through with ADSI Edit, and then making the API calls with the PowerShell or VB script and pulling that information out and then doing cool stuff with it.
And in fact, Mark Hewitt in our team has created a fling which allows you to do recomposition of a subset of VMs in a pool. So very useful for those of you that are managing large pools to do recomposition or recompose operations with Composer. You can download that from our VMware.com website. Highly recommend you take a look at that. And he uses PowerShell there to kick off those
Is everyone familiar with what our flings are? I mean, I know you know what a fling is. But VMware Flings is labs.vmware.com, and basically we have a lot of really brilliant software developers, and occasionally what they do is they say, well, I need a little tool to do something to help me do my job. And then after a while they start to think, hey, this little tool is kind of cool, and I want to share it with people. And so what we've decided to do is to make this whole section of VMware.com available for that kind of stuff. So something cool, we go through it, the lawyers spend a while going through it, making sure it's all kosher, and then we put it up on that website. So you can go and find some really excellent tools. There's several hundred there now. They come without support, without GSS support. However, there is a community where you could post questions, and chances are person who wrote the fling will be the person who gets back to you with an answer.
Okay, we need to speed up because we're a little bit behind here. So essentially what we're going to talk about now is once the VM has been, or virtual desktop's been allocated to the user and I've been signed on, I now need to start the session, fire up PC over IP on the agent, and then connect the client. So what the broker does, it sends a message to the virtual desktop to say, hey, start a session. And that's what you can see here. You can see my session ID for my particular session. The start session message has been sent to the agent. And the agent, which is running on the virtual desktop, responds that I've got the start session message. And then you'll see in the logs a whole bunch of information about the client device that's connecting, the domain, the user, et cetera, and then you'll see some stuff start up around PC over IP. But in the event database, we're saying, right, the session has been started, and I'm waiting basically to hear back from the agent pending, okay? The broker will then, once it gets the message back from the desktop to say, I've started the session, it says start session completed, then it will tell me that basically the user has then been connected. So if the session started, okay, I can then start to connect the user, and it will state Matt C is connected to that machine. So there you can quickly see which desktop the user is connected to without having to go through ADSI edit. And then the client connects to the VM. So PC over IP is fired up, the client will then connect, and I then get this acknowledgement that the PC over IP session has started. Okay, you get this PC over IP on connection complete begin. And then you get this Windows Terminal Server session logon. You'll get that regardless if it's RDP or PC over IP, okay? And then finally, once the user's logged in and the agents confirm that with the connection server, we log this event called agent connected, okay? If you don't get that, you're probably after 15 minutes, you're going to get cut off and you'll see the agent pending expired. So very quickly, just cover the event database. You can just, it's installed on your database server, however you set it up. I use Studio Express. I can go in there and take a look there, or I can use SQL to query the event database for various different items that we've indicated here. And it pretty much logs all those main. You can go in there and see what it's logging. It's logging things like the administrator console access, broker machines that have been allocated to users, et cetera, okay? And you can see here I've put View Composer on there as well. So what else can go wrong around desktop not available? So what about if I don't have any desktops available, and why does this happen? Okay, you can identify this in the event database, broker provisioning error. You'll see it in the View Administrator console on the particular pool. It'll highlight that it's not provisioning. And as I mentioned earlier, sometimes this can be caused because View Composer does not have the right access to the ESX hosts. Okay, port 902. Sometimes we also see that the agent is unavailable. And as I mentioned, this is because either the agent can't connect to the connection server, or possibly it's stuck in some kind of customization event or state. And you can see that again in the administrator console. Typically this is related to things like, we can't connect to AD, you don't have enough ports on the vSwitch, network connectivity issues.
Maybe your DHCP scope has run out of IP addresses, another very difficult situation to troubleshoot. Just one thing that I've run into a few times, folks using Microsoft's DHCP, and the default setting is what? 8 days. I mean, that was so 2002. Now we need to flip IP addresses probably every hour or so. So, just make sure when you're setting up your View environment, you want to take a look at the timeout for the DHCP addresses. Otherwise, you do end up running out of addresses in the scope.
And finally, what we also see is sometimes View Composer doesn't have the correct domain rights to join desktops to the domain. So you need to enter in credentials in the View Administrator console to allow View Composer to go in and set up or join desktops to the domain. If you don't have the right credentials, you might get domain join failed and therefore hasn't customized correctly, and the desktop will not be available. And you'll see this in the View Composer logs. On the View Composer machine, you'll see in the logs that fatal error there that is telling you that the domain join failed.
And don't worry, no one was ever killed because the domain join failed. It's not really fatal.
Before I spin up lots of desktops, typically what I do is with vSphere Client, I log in with the View service account into vCenter, and I do things like, provisioning a few VMs, make sure I've got the correct permissions in vCenter, try and join that desktop to the domain using my View Composer credentials, just to make sure that everything is working as I would think before I start to spin up, my 5,000 VMs. Finally, domain 3, broken broker. Okay, sometimes some of the components on the broker will fail. We'll talk a little about some of those. So maybe the broker can't talk to vCenter, maybe View Composer's broken. But specifically, we'll talk a little bit about JMS and Adam. So we use Adam to replicate configuration information between connection servers. So that View LDAP information that you see, we use the Microsoft Adam technology to replicate that across a cluster of connection servers. Sometimes this can fail. It's very easy to troubleshoot. Obviously, look in the Windows event logs for this. But we also have, there's also a little tool that you can use on the connection server, this repadmin.exe, which most of you are probably familiar with. And you can just run this to see the replication state of that particular connection server. vCenter server connectivity, often either network related or someone's decided to shut down vCenter, very useful. Shutting down vCenter will basically just stop you from doing any provisioning or power operations. Your users can still connect to their virtual desktops if they are powered on. Okay? View Composer. Talking of vCenter, a number of times we've come into customers that have complained about corruption issues, problems with View Composer. And what it's boiled down to is someone's gone into vCenter and basically started administering View desktops inside vCenter server. So someone who doesn't realize what's going on, that View's driving these, the creation and administration of these desktop VMs, they're like, renaming them, moving them, deleting them, and this completely messes with View. So our recommendation is please do not manage these VMs from vCenter, okay? Use the View console to manage these pools and desktops. But it happens, and when it does happen, essentially what happens is the View Composer database gets out of sync with vCenter. And then Composer gets very confused, and we get some corruption in the Composer database. We start to get orphan VMs, and essentially Composer could potentially stop provisioning VMs because it thinks that a VM exists in the View Composer database, but it doesn't in Virtual Center. And you'll typically see in the View Composer logs, when you get this corruption issue, this virtual machine with input specification already exists. There's a KB article there that will walk you through how to clean up View Composer, okay, and orphan VMs. I know it's not pretty, and I know it's command line, but there is a process there to help you clear that up.
The good news is that it doesn't often happen on its own. It's very rare. It usually only happens when the vSphere admin is trying to be helpful.
The final point, JMS connectivity. So I talked about Adam replication, but we also use technology, the Java message bus technology, SwiftMQ. We use that to communicate between the components live session information about what's going on. We use it so that if you've got multiple connection servers, they can orchestrate power operations, provisioning operations. We do not support split site architecture for View. So you can't stick a View connection server in one site and then stick a replica in the other site. Yes, Adam will replicate across the WAN absolutely fine, but JMS won't work across a WAN-connected network. Okay? It's very latency intolerant, so what will happen is if the network spikes, JMS messages may get dropped. We look to poll View agents or desktops and other connection servers every few seconds. We expect lightning fast response. If we don't get it, then JMS starts to get very upset, and we start to get some what we call split brain. So the one View connection server will think, hang on, I'm not getting a response. It'll start to do some things on its own, provision VMs on its own. You get two connection servers trying to provision the same VM, and the world ends.
And then hilarity ensues, and yada, yada, yada.
So you can spot in the connection server logs, if you're having JMS connectivity issues, these tracker rejoin and resync messages. Okay, domain 4. We're running out of time here. We're not going to dive into this too much because there are other sessions on troubleshooting ESX and storage. But clearly, storage I/O bottlenecks have been a major issue for VDI deployments. Okay, clearly you need to look at that. Don't size the VMware Maximums. Okay, just because you can put 1,000 VMs on a host doesn't mean you should. Keep cluster and host utilization below 80%. Check that things like VM utilization, that you don't have someone, massively utilizing a VM 90, 100%. Okay, use the tools that are available to you in vCenter and these third-party tools out there, Zangati, vCops, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to dive into too much of this because we're conscious that we want some time for questions. So yeah, get some help, read the product documentation, read the manual, please, thank you. Double check your configurations, use the communities, use the knowledge base website, but also on the connection server is a thing called support.bat, okay? You can use this batch file and it'll run a whole bunch of tests in your environment and it'll zip up all those logs. I highly recommend running that, unzipping that little set of logs, and you can actually then start to see some of the problems in your environment as well. And we use this to kind of bundle up logs and send on to GSS. Don't be frightened to submit a support request. Okay, so I think we're just going to kind of jump over to some questions very quickly.
Can you just go back one slide for me? Something I wanted to talk about as a resource available to you is the Why Choose View microsite. This is, we're framing it as competitive information, but the good news is that there's also a lot of really good product information. This is a place where VMware can communicate this information back to you, so I would strongly recommend you check that out. Also, please do take the time to fill out the surveys. We were just reading our awesome results from the last survey, the last session. So we really do read it. We read it to take your input, your guidance on what we should deliver to you.
And don't forget to download the slides and use it as reference. It will be helpful to you and help you kind of navigate your way around view problems. We have got 3 minutes, so we'll take 1 or 2 questions from the floor if you wish. Please step up to a microphone so everyone can hear you. Any questions?
For those of you on your way out, thank you very much for your time
thanks
today.
for coming, guys. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Can
you step up to a microphone, please? Yeah, go for it.
During the troubleshooting,
Oh, it's not on.
I'm sorry?
do you ever come talk to VMugs?
Just shout it at me and I'll repeat it.
I don't enough. I do occasionally. I would, yeah.
So I'm the VMug leader for Dallas.
Oh, great. Okay.
So I'm trying to get, I do a lot of View myself, so I try to get more of that.
Yeah, cool.
If I send you a drop in now?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Issues where the registry doesn't unload cleanly, those volatile keys are still loaded, and then we see a communication problem, we get the desktop unavailable.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. So talking about some of the keys that are set up around the session, and if basically what you're doing is, I guess, logging off that session, those keys don't get cleaned, the session information doesn't get cleaned out, and the agent is unavailable. Yeah, we have seen that issue. I mean, John, have you got any thoughts around it?
I'm sorry, I was taking a sidebar question, so I didn't hear the question.
He's basically suggesting that view agent session information is kept in the registry, and when a user logs off, it's not being cleaned correctly. Sounds like the session's being cut prematurely.
Yeah. You know, a really good thing to do with stuff like that is to file a support request with GSS, so that if maybe we do have a bug, also known as incomplete software, you know, we can maybe get that hole fixed. But I've not run into that, so it sounds to me like it just might be, you know,
I've heard of that once before, but it was intermittent, and they never got to the kind of root cause of it.
The other thing I wanted to just add on was the connection brokers.
Oh, okay. So the gentleman here is, which version are you using?
We just stepped up to 5.1 recently. But
Oh, and you're still seeing the problem?
in certain cases, I think it's going away. But we're seeing that we've also introduced previously from previous versions the Microsoft Hive cleanup to try to
Right.
push registry keys down. And we've been looking at that tool, but we've still seen instances where after we've been doing some migration, some upgrades, that this problem started to crop up.
This gentleman suggested, you know, upgrading fixed it for him, so maybe there was a bug in the agent or something like that.
Yeah, we've been doing that as well. We've been recycling, reinstalling the agents, doing a number of things. I was wondering if you had any guidance on those type of issues, because we'd really like to make sure that those.
Okay. You know what? We'll take it as an action item. We'll figure out how we can help you out with that.
The other thing was the brokers. I know she didn't touch too much on Java versus the brokers versus their memory requirements and their virtual size. That was very critical.
So, you know, it's important to know that the connection brokers keep this session state map in memory. We do that because serving up the information out of memory is an activity that we want to have occurring with very low latency. Challenge is if we run out of memory, we can't fit the entire session state map in the contents of RAM, and then we have to page it out via Windows, and that's not a good scenario. So when you're a connection server, runs out of memory and Windows is able to handle it. We just have really slow brokering. Boy, that's annoying. The other thing is if we say we have a split brain scenario and there's latency on the cluster, then we could have an unhandled out-of-memory condition which crashes the connection server. So the absolute minimum amount of RAM for a connection server is 10 gig, and you got to keep a really good eye on it. Of course, Java is going to consume all that memory because that's how it rolls. But 10 gig is the minimum.
Because we're basically, each of the subcomponents on the connection server is using JVM, and each of those are kind of taking a 2 gig memory, chunk. So that's why we recommend 10 gig for anything over 50 desktops, really.
Yep. So we're at the end of the session. I want to do one question over here, and then Matt and I will take questions out in the hallway because the speaker teams have asked us to please vacate the room at the end of the session. So why don't you go ahead?
I just want to see if you could just give a quick starting point for troubleshooting issues with the events database itself.
Can you hear
I
me?
will see the
I can't hear you.
Yeah, we can't hear you.
You know what?
I'll tell you what. Thank you very much for your time today. We'll be in the hallway, and we're happy to spend a few minutes with your questions. Thank you for coming today.
Yeah, thanks a lot.